This is a Film Stories original podcast.
We made this.
Welcome everyone to the X-Cast. The truth is in here. I'm your host, Tony Black, and welcome back to I Want to Believe Minute, where we unpick the second X-Files movie 1 minute at a time. Today, helping me to explore minute 24, which runs from approximately 23 minutes as Mulder talks to Whitney, all the way through to 23 minutes 59 seconds as Mulder still talks to Whitney, is regular X-Cast guest, Russ Hugo. Welcome, Russ.
Thank you again. This is a lot of fun. Looking forward to this minute.
Journey continues through this ongoing scene, and this is the first proper conversation that we get between Mulder and Whitney, where they really get into it, I guess, really. And I like the interaction between these two. It does. It does feel like the old dynamic between Mulder and Scully, except it's not Scully. There really is a kind of back and forth between these two that reminded me of how Mulder and Scully used to act. And it's really quite intriguing to see that framed through a completely different FBI character.
It is, especially when you think that the script is positioning Whitney as being the Scully of the pair between her and Drummy. And that, I think, makes it much more successful. And this is one of the topics I've been waiting to speak with you about. And maybe now's the time to bring it up, because I'm really curious to get your take, because it's something that's been in the back of my mind since the Revival series with, this has probably been brought up by other folks, but Miller and Einstein. And just looking at comparing those two pairs, that it is night and day on nearly every level. And I don't mean to attack the actors who play Miller and Einstein, because they're very talented actors.
Yeah.
I've seen them do great work. But contrastingly, one of the highlights of this film for me is the successful duplication of sorts, the reinvention of the Mulder and Scully pair through Drummy and Whitney, precisely for one of the reasons that you just mentioned, that Whitney is kind of in this ambiguous space. And similarly, Drummy is a mix of Doggett and maybe a harsh bit of Scully. It's not, the analog isn't so clear. They can still have that same conflict that Carter coded into the show to drive the drama, but they're not stock cartoonish inversions like Miller and Einstein are. And also, I feel that both of these actors fit the characters a little bit better for me. I feel it's one of the more successful executions of this film, and something that I'd like to celebrate. What's your overall take on that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't to this day, and I'd be really, really interested to hear what my fellow co-hosts and everyone, when we do talk about season 10, and when we get Miller and Einstein, I'll be fascinated to hear people's thoughts on this, because it's a big distance. Because I to this day, I don't understand what that was. I don't. It was such a strange flex by Carter, that whole thing, when he'd done in previous cases, both with Doggett and Reyes particularly, but then Whitney and Drummy on a much more small scale, not getting to explore it very much, but he created, like you said, more interesting archetypal versions of this partnership. It's hard to understand why that ended up happening subsequently. It feels like ultimately all of these kind of characters, they are it's like this is why I'd be very interested, and I might be going off topic here, and I please pull me back, Russ.
That's what these are for. They're for wandering these paths. Go nuts.
It's kind of what they've. Yeah, you're right. But if they do reboot the show, it's why I think that it would work without Duchovny and Anderson in one way, because I think the conceptual idea of a believer and a skeptic and that archetypal detective pairing is a brilliant thing. And it's not just didn't start with the X-Files, it goes back, I mentioned Sherlock Holmes in the last one, but it goes back to Holmes and Watson to an extent, and maybe even characters before those two. But I think Carter's always been fascinated by variations on that dynamic. But the reality is, he was never able to recreate the magic of Duchovny and Anderson together, and that's where the X-Files will be fascinating to see going forward, because you're never ever going to be able to recreate that magic with other partnerships, whether it's Mulder and Scully as characters just rebooted with different actors, or it's new characters like these guys in a whole new idea. It's a bit like how when they've revived previous characters who were played by iconic actors before in different properties, it's never quite the same. The one I always think of is William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy, with Star Trek. You can never get that back, what they had, and with DeForest Kelley as well, with that trio. As fun as it is to see Chris Pine and Zachary Quinto and Carl Urban, it's not the same, and so there's... My point being, I think you had, with Whitney and Drummy, a very interesting variation on the theme, but I don't think you can ever quite capture what that Mulder and Scully dynamic was. Not just the way those characters were written, but the way they were performed in that moment. So it's a long-winded way of getting to my answer, Russ, I think. But yeah, I do think they're a very interesting pairing, to be fair. And it is a shame that we never got to see more of them together.
Yeah, it's well said. I can't argue with any of that. The only caveat I would maybe add to it is that one of the issues is that Carter or the creators would create these characters, these secondary pairs, but they never got the chance to stand on their own two legs to see what would happen. So they're kind of crippled from the beginning. We had a few moments where Doggett got a chance to become his own character, and we saw that was successful. Reyes really didn't get that chance. In my perspective, these two characters don't at all, but I still think they're successful with how little they're given. Miller and Einstein kind of got less into some degree, but they also, I think, had less to work with even from the start. So there's that thing where you have to have the confidence and take the chance. And obviously, as we've talked about X-Cast on season 9, they just never could take off those training wheels of Mulder and Scully off the bike and let anybody else ever even make an attempt at doing something new with it. So I'm not sure if it's actually just an inherent... Of course, you're never going to be able to. I mean, just you look at the odds. How many pairs are there in television that are matched to Duchovny and Anderson in this role? So we're probably never going to reach those heights, but we could have reached something better with some of these pairs potentially. And I think both Pete and Exhibit do a pretty great job. This scene is not, in my opinion, the strongest for Pete in the film, but overall, I think she's great. And I think Exhibit, for how little he has to work with, and that's not a critique of the script, it's a packed script. He does a good job. Yeah. I feel, and even watching this with my partner, and they weren't familiar with Exhibit as an actor, but simply as a musician, and were kind of really shocked. Like, not in the sense that they would have expected them to be bad, but didn't recognize them as Exhibit because they were kind of filling the role so well. I just want to give him some credit for what he's doing, bringing to it as not a professionally trained actor. I want to give him some props.
No, he's good. He is good. Like you say, he doesn't have a vast amount to work with, but he is good, and he would have had potential really. But obviously, Pete gets more to do in this scene. What's really interesting in a way is that Whitney it feels like she's both Scully and Mulder at the same time, because she's talking. This whole back and forth is about how she doesn't believe Joe. She thinks he got the he got the right house. I mean, this is a bit of a stretch, but he'd watch TV and that's how he found the right house. No, he found the right house because it was across the road. But anyway, that's beside. We talked about that. But she's talking about how, you know, she thinks that Joe this is all a con job in order to gain forgiveness. She's talked about how he's written letters to the Vatican previously. She thinks he's guilty. Mulder's not sure. But at the same time, Mulder makes the point, well, you brought me in. You know, you brought me in. And as a result, she's not very popular. You know, she's become the spooky archetype, you know, the Mulder-like figure within the Bureau, you know, turned into this kooky, mad guy that everyone in the Bureau thinks is nuts, you know, who's been out of the game for a long time for helping this. So he's kind of saying, well, if you didn't think there was something more to this, why would you call me? You know, you could have got all kinds of people to validate the idea that Joe isn't psychic and that he's just doing this in order to try and regain some level of reputation and con people, you know, as classic psychopaths do. But why call me? You know, and she has knowledge. She has knowledge of the past. She mentions some of the characters we've talked about in this block of minutes. You know, some iconic X-Files, quote unquote, monsters or psychics. Luther Lee Boggs from Beyond the Sea. Clyde Bruckman from Clyde Bruckman's Final Repose. Gerald Schnauz, which is the deeper cut, but Unruh in season 4. You know, great Easter eggs. But she mentions all these people, so she must have an interest in the X-Files and Mulder's work, even though it's completely dead at this point, you know, in the Bureau terms. So it feels like on one hand she's doing the Scully skeptic thing, but on the other, she's also Mulder. So it's interesting how Carter writes her as the combination of the two, I feel.
It is, and that's one of the things I think that works really well for the character, in that the tension for her between those two is placed so well in the system that she's working in, and the contrast with Exhibit. And it makes the character a little bit more interesting. Compared to, as an example, Mulder is in the basement when he's in the X-Files. The X-Files is a thing. He's isolated. Whitney is an ASAC, excuse me. And
ASAC.
Yeah, an ASAC. And is clearly embellished in the establishment as an upper office, has a big team, and does not have that same flexibility that if she was exactly like Mulder, it wouldn't make sense in the world that they're creating. And that's what I really like, in the sense that she's studied Mulder and is bringing him in as another piece of the team, but it's not this institutional placement like where Mulder was. There's a very clear difference between the two.
Right.
And that's what one of the other reasons I like having this pair in here, to be able to see this is where Mulder and Scully were, and this is where the FBI is now, and this is where and why they don't fit in here. And it's a fairly successful execution, I think, on the part of the script.
And I think if for X-Files fans with the deeper knowledge, I think it helps sell the problem of the fact that when the show ended, the FBI seemed to be full of these weird, scary alien replicant characters who've just now completely sort of, you know, there's no reference to that, obviously, in this film. But, you know, in the deeper lore of the mythology, there's a whole reason why Mulder ended up at the FBI and technically on the run, which this film conveniently, we talked about this in previous minutes, but it conveniently ignores. But I think if you think of these, Whitney and Drummy in this context of what the FBI is now, I think that is an interesting way of approaching it, really. But, you know, Mulder says, I'm only half the team here, which is a great acknowledgement that in his mind, the only reason that he was so successful at what he did all those years in the X-Files was because he had Scully with him, which is great. But Whitney says, but it's your insights I need, which again underscores how she feels like he has something to offer, whereas the rest of the FBI, you know, if we assume they're not aliens, they just don't. They just don't think, they think he's nuts. They've always thought he's nuts. You know, he's got nothing. So I think it's a great acknowledgement for Mulder that he's only as great as he is because of Scully. But maybe the common perception has never been that everyone who believes in what Mulder did or what he believed in thought that Mulder was the guy, and that almost Scully was the tag on. Whereas we know that's different. Having watched the show, we know that Mulder would be dead. Mulder would have been dead years ago if it wasn't for Scully, you know, or he would have just been a complete shell of a human being. So yeah, it's interesting. I think that those perceptions outside are interesting, and how Whitney sees him in this film, I think, is really interesting.
Yeah, 100%. And that's also a major theme or thesis, I think, of the film, is that Mulder would be dead if it wasn't for Scully. Hence the ending, and hence even with Scully being so distracted by all of these ongoing hospital-based problems and pressures. Like in the previous minute we talked about where the quick interaction between Scully and Mulder, where there's the flashback to or not a flashback, but the classic scene of, here's the folder, I need you to go do an autopsy kind of thing. Can you do this pathology thing? Hands it over. Scully is horribly distracted. This isn't her world, but even then she still later, of course, notices things that the FBI team doesn't, but it's not recognized for that sense. And then Mulder is floundering on his own, and how many of those interactions in the film between Mulder and Scully are just so much about Mulder begging Scully to be there because he's so insecure, justifiably, doing this work without her, even though she clearly has justification for not participating. So I really do like that you highlighted that last phrase there about the I'm only half the team. Whereas I think it's a really important focal point for what the film is one of the main things the film is doing, and I think does successfully.
Yeah, me too, because it absolutely establishes that Scully has a life that she can perfectly exist fine in, working as a doctor, etc., in a hospital, but Mulder doesn't, Mulder, without her, he's just this bearded man living in a cave, obsessed with conspiracies. So it is a really crucial factor to it, and I think that this kind of scene really draws that out very well.
To be fair, really quick, if I can throw in, to be fair, another thing I do like about this film, again, because it balances things fairly well, is that I do like that scene, I think it might be later on, where they're both in bed, and Mulder states, you should sleep, I'll curse God for you. And there are some moments there where the show or the script does show, like, that this relationship isn't 100% one-sided, but it is imbalanced, as a realistic relationship would be. And that's one of the things. If you're gonna have to avoid the no Romo camp, they do some interesting things with this relationship that avoid a lot of other tropes and things, even on in this space here, and the way that it's presented, both their intellectual, their physical, and their emotional intimacies are surprisingly, I think, complex for such a concise, packed film with so much stuff going on with it, all the baggage it brings with it.
Well, we'll wrap up this minute and we'll talk about the ending of this overarching scene with Mulder and Whitney and these characters in the final minute of this block with myself and Russ. We'll get into some of that in the next minute. So please come back and join us for minute 25. But thanks for listening. And again, until then, always remember, trust no one.